The Great Gatsby, Chapter 9, the final chapter. Here's a quiz question right away. After 2 years, Nick says, I remember the rest of that day and that night and the next day only as an endless drill of police and photographers and newspapermen in and out of Gatsby's front door. So this part is being narrated 2 years after Gatsby has died. We do get some background information here, which is really helpful. Remember, in an earlier chapter, we weren't really sure how Nick knew all the things that had happened at Wilson's garage after they left when Myrtle was hit by the car. And we do find out that Michaelis, who is the man who has the coffee shop across from Wilson's garage, was interviewed by the police and also at an inquest. And so he gave a testimony, which is how it became public knowledge of what happened after Myrtle was killed. So Michaelis's testimony at the inquest brought to light Wilson's suspicions of his wife. I thought the whole tale would shortly be served up in a racy pasquinade. So Michaelis shares the information with the police that George Wilson thought his wife was having an affair. And interestingly, Catherine doesn't verify this. And of course, Catherine knows that Myrtle and Tom were having an affair, but she pretends that she has no idea. And she showed a surprising amount of character about it and swore that her sister had never seen Gatsby, that her sister was completely happy with her husband. Well, of course, it's true she probably hadn't seen Gatsby, but certainly Catherine knows she was having an affair with Tom, and that her sister had been into no mischief whatever. So these could be quiz questions too. Just, what does Catherine say about Myrtle? So in the end, Wilson is reduced to a man deranged by grief. So he just is sort of characterized as a crazy person. Nick says that he finds himself alone with Gatsby, that there's nobody else really who cares about the fact that he has died, and nobody to do anything about the arrangements. So every practical question is referred to Nick. He finds that he is responsible because no one else is interested. And he says interested in that, personal way that everyone is entitled to at the end. And no one is there for Gatsby. So Nick calls up Daisy a half hour after they find Gatsby, and she and Tom have already left. And the person, who answers the phone at her house says that they took baggage and there's no address and they don't know when they're going to be back. So, remember how Nick told Gatsby he should get out of town? Well, Daisy and Tom get out of town because clearly they each have their own reasons for wanting to do that. Nick feels a strong need to get someone for Gatsby. He says, I wanted to get somebody for him. I'll get somebody for you, Gatsby. Don't worry, just trust me, and I'll get somebody for you. This is something that Nick is thinking, but it still could sort of show up on a quiz about quote identification. So the obvious person that Nick thinks about first is Meyer Wolfsheim, because remember, that's who they had lunch with that one time in the city. And Meyer Wolfsheim and Gatsby have a very close relationship in terms of business. So he tries to call him and no one answers the phone. And every time he gets through and he says, it's very important. And whoever answers says, no one's there. This is probably the operator on the phone. No one's there. And Nick just continues to hear in his head Gatsby protesting, saying, look here, old sport, you've got to get somebody for me. You've got to try hard. I can't go through this alone. So again, this is Nick imagining Gatsby because Gatsby's dead. He's not literally saying these things. So he goes upstairs. Nick goes upstairs to Gatsby's room, trying to find maybe some more information about how to contact people. And eventually he finds the address for Wolfsheim. And he sends a letter with the butler to Wolfsheim in New York, hoping to encourage him to come out and help. Nick is sure that Wolfsheim would start right away when he saw the newspapers, but that doesn't happen. Mr. Wolfsheim doesn't arrive, nor does any communication from him. And now Nick's feelings are changing. He begins to have a feeling of defiance, of scornful solidarity between Gatsby and me against them all. So we definitely see here Nick's feelings changing throughout this period, really feeling not only sorry for Gatsby and devoted to Gatsby, but angry for Gatsby that nobody who claims to be close to him bothers to show up at this terrible time. Finally, he gets a letter from Meyer Wolfsheim, and this is what it says. Dear Mr. Carraway, this has been one of the most terrible shocks of my life to me. I hardly can believe that it is true at all. Such a mad act as that man did should make us all think. I cannot come down now as I am tied up in some very important business and cannot get mixed up in this thing now. This thing. If there is anything I can do a little later, let me know in a letter by Edgar. I hardly know where I am when I hear about a thing like this, and I am completely knocked down and out. And then a hasty addenda, let me know about the funeral, etc. Do not know his family at all. So clearly, he's such a criminal. He can't be seen in public. He can't be associated with Gatsby. And Nick doesn't fully understand this. He's incensed, I'm sure, that this man can't even come out to the house and give Nick a hand. So finally then the phone rings, and I'm sure Nick is hoping that it's, somebody saying they're going to come and help him. And instead he gets this on the phone. This is Slagle speaking. And Nick says, yes. Hell of a mess, isn't it? Get my wire? There haven't been any wires. Young Park's in trouble, he said rapidly. They picked him up when he handed the bonds over the counter. So clearly this is mob communication. Somebody got caught, and he's calling to tell Gatsby, and he thinks that Nick is Gatsby. And finally Nick says, look here, this isn't Mr. Gatsby. Mr. Gatsby's dead. There's a long silence on the other end. I'm sure that, you can imagine that this person is thinking, oh my gosh, someone, made a hit on Gatsby, thinking that it's some sort of, mob-related killing, but in fact it was just Mr. Wilson getting revenge. Finally then, it says here, on the third day after Gatsby died, so this could be important as a detail, a telegram comes, signed Henry C. Gatz, and it came from a town in Minnesota. It said only that the sender was leaving immediately and to postpone the funeral until he came. So thankfully, I'm sure Nick is relieved, someone is coming. This is Gatsby's father, so this could be a quiz question. Henry Gatz is Gatsby's father, a solemn old man, very helpless and dismayed. His eyes leaked continuously with excitement, and when I took the bag and umbrella from his hands, he began to pull so incessantly at his sparse gray beard that I had difficulty getting off his coat. He was on the point of collapse, so I took him into the music room and made him sit down while I sent for something to eat. But he wouldn't eat, and the glass of milk spilled from his trembling hand. So he's very much in shock and grieving the loss of his son. He says he saw that his son died in the Chicago newspaper, and he started right away to come here. And then he says it must have been a madman. He must have been a madman to kill Gatsby. And Nick tries to offer him some coffee. He says, I don't want anything, Mr. Carraway. And then he says, where have they got my Jimmy? So this is his real name. Remember, it's James Gatz was Gatsby's real name, and his dad calls him Jimmy. He takes the father into the drawing room where Gatsby is laying still. So they have him embalmed, sort of lying in state in the house. Some little boys had come up the steps and were looking into the hall. So just imagine this. The door is open for people to come and visit the body, just like you would have in a funeral home. And like just strangers, like little kids are coming in. Nobody of any, relation except for this father is coming. It's just nosy children. A little while after Mr. Gatz opens the door and he comes back out, his mouth is ajar, and his eyes are leaking isolated and unpunctual tears, which means slow tears. He'd reached an age where death no longer had the quality of ghastly surprise. So because he's older, he understands grief. His grief began to be mixed with an awed pride. So he's looking at this house, and seeing what an amazing place his son lived in. And Nick says, I didn't know what you'd want, Mr. Gatsby, meaning like what he might want to do for a funeral or what he might want to do with the body. And his father says, Gats is my name. Mr. Gats, I thought you might want to take the body west. And his father says, no, Jimmy always liked it better out east. He rose up to his position in the east. Were you a friend of my boys? And Nick says, we were close friends. So this is also a quote that pops up sometimes on quote tests that Nick says, we were close friends. His father says, if he'd lived, he'd have been a great man. A man like James Hill, he'd have helped build up the country, which of course, he's imagining that his son got all this wealth like the business owners who started things like, steel companies and railroads and things like that. He has no idea that his son was an organized crime. So he's not exactly building up the country in the way that his father imagines, which is why Nick would be uncomfortable about this. He finally gets his father up into a room and he falls asleep. And then the phone rings again and it's Klipspringer. So remember, Klipspringer was the boarder who spent so much time living in Gatsby's house in between all those parties. He was the one that was playing the piano when Daisy came to visit and who they saw doing exercises in his bedroom. So Nick is relieved. It seems like another person is going to come to his grave, and I didn't want it to be in the papers and draw a sightseeing crowd, so I've been calling up a few people myself, and that they were hard to find. So Nick didn't put anything in the paper about the death because he doesn't want people like who are nosy to show up. He wants real friends to show up. And so he's been calling people, and so he's happy to hear from Klipspringer. And he tells Klipspringer, the funeral's tomorrow at 3:00, and I wish you tell anybody who'd be interested. And suddenly there's this awkward conversation that makes it clear that Klipspringer himself is not going to be coming. And he admits that what he called up about was that he's staying with some people in Greenwich. And, it's like a, country sort of weekend thing. And he needs to be able to play tennis with them. And he left shoes at Gatsby's house. And he's hoping that Nick can send the shoes to where he is staying. So Nick is furious about this. And he hangs up on him. After that, I felt a certain shame for Gatsby. So here's another transition of feelings that Nick is having. He went from being angry and sort of standing in solidarity with Gatsby to now feeling shame for him. One gentleman that Nick had phoned implied that Gatsby had got what he deserved. However, that was not my fault, for he was one of those who used to sneer, or that was my fault because he was one of those who used to sneer at Gatsby on the courage of Gatsby's liquor, and I should have known better than to call him. So he realizes that some people he called maybe didn't like him anyway, but obviously some people he believes should have been responding to the funeral. So on the morning of the funeral, he goes up to New York to see Meyer Wolfsheim because he's really determined to get him there. And when Nick gets to Meyer Wolfsheim's office, he has a hard time getting in. The name of the office is the Swastika Holding Company. Remember, this is the Jewish mafia. And he goes in and meets Wolfsheim's secretary, who is described as a lovely Jewess who has black hostile eyes. And she tells Nick that nobody is there, that Mr. Wolfsheim has gone to Chicago, but Nick knows this is obviously true because he hears somebody whistling in the other office. And he says to the woman, please tell him that Mr. Carraway wants to see him. And she snaps that, she can't get him back from Chicago. And then he hears Mr. Wolfsheim call out to the woman. Her name is Stella. And she has to try and cover this. She says, well, leave your name on the desk. I'll give it to him when he gets back. And Nick pushes her. He says, I know he's there, because obviously he's just heard him speak. And then she gets mad and she sliding her hands up and down her hips. And she says, you young men think you can force your way in here any time. We're getting sick and tired of it. When I say he's in Chicago, he's in Chicago. But then Nick mentions Gatsby. And so then she realizes she has to let him in. So then Meyer Wolfsheim comes out. standing solemnly in the doorway. And he tells Nick the story of when he first met Gatsby. He says that Gatsby was so hard up, he had to keep on wearing his uniform because he couldn't buy some regular clothes. And the first time he saw him was when he came into Weinbrenner's pool room at 43rd Street and asked for a job. He hadn't eaten anything for a couple of days. "Come on, have some lunch with me," I said. He ate more than $4 worth of food in half an hour. I can imagine that this would be shortly after he left Louisville on that train with no money. He probably went to New York and tried to find a job. And that's when he found Wolfsheim. And Nick asked if he started him in business, and Wolfsheim says, "Oh, I made him. He basically introduced him to organized crime." He says, "I got him to join up in the American Legion, and he used to stand high there. Right off, he did some work for a client of mine up to Albany." So he's moving illegal products, most likely. And he says that they were always together. Nick wonders if this partnership also included the World Series transaction in 1919. And then Nick says, "Well, now he's dead. You were his closest friend, so I know you'll want to come to his funeral this afternoon." And Meyer Wolfsheim says, "I'd like to come." And then Nick says, "Well, come then." He really wants to get him there. And then Wolfsheim says, "No, I can't do it. I can't get mixed up in it." So he can't be seen in public associated with Gatsby. And Nick says, "Nothing to get mixed up in. It's all over now." I mean, this shows how naive Nick is, because even though Gatsby's dead, Wolfsheim is still involved in organized crime. And Wolfsheim persists. He says, "When a man gets killed, I never like to get mixed up in it in any way. I keep out. When I was a young man, it was different. If a friend of mine died, no matter how, I stuck with them to the end. You may think that's sentimental, but I mean it, to the bitter end." Probably before he was in organized crime. So Nick sees he's determined not to come. And Wolfsheim then says, "Are you a college man?" And Nick says, yes. And he's kind of worried that maybe he's going to try and offer him a job. And Wolfsheim's bit of wisdom is this. He says, "Let us learn to show our friendship for a man when he is alive and not after he is dead," he suggested. "After that, my own rule is to let everything alone." So this could be a quiz question too. So when he gets back to his house, after having failed to get Wolfsheim to come out, he encounters again Gatsby's father, who says he has something to show him. He said, "Jimmy sent me this picture. Look here." And he takes out this picture, and it's a picture of the house. And he says, he sent me this picture. It's a very pretty picture. It shows up well. And Nick asks if he'd seen his son lately. And his father says that Gatsby had come out to see him 2 years ago and bought him the house he lives in now. He admits that he was broken up when he ran away from home, but he says, "I see now there was a reason for it. He knew he had a big future in front of him, and ever since he made a success, he was very generous with me." So Gatsby definitely used some of his money to improve the lifestyle of his parents. And of course, there's no mention of a mother, so I don't know if the mother has died or if it's just the father who's able to travel. We never really find that out. So then he also pulls out a book. This is also something important to know. This is another one of these quiz questions. He pulls out a book called Hop Along Cassidy. And he said that this is a book that Gatsby had as a little boy. And he opened the book, and it says that there's a schedule in there from September 12th, 1906. And it's the entire schedule that little boy Gatsby had written out for his day. Rise from bed and exercise and study various things and work and play sports and practice elocution, poise, and how to attain it. Study needed inventions. So this is sort of entrepreneurial, that as a young boy, he's sort of organizing his life in this way. And then he has general resolves. No wasting time at Shafters. No more smoking or chewing. Okay, so he wasn't a little boy. He's probably like, a young teenager, maybe even middle school aged. Bathe every other day. Okay. Save $5 or maybe $3 per week. Be better to parents. And the father says, I came across this book by accident. It just shows you, doesn't it? So what it shows us is that Gatsby had plans for himself to get out of his life that he had at the farm. And these were the steps he believed he needed to take in order to accomplish that. The father also admits that Gatsby once yelled at his father that he ate like a hog, and his father beat him for it. So his father was being criticized by Gatsby when Gatsby was younger. So then we have rain. Remember that weather plays a big part in this story. Rain, generally in a book, is a symbol for new beginnings, for like the washing away of problems. And on the day of this funeral, now it has begun to rain. So at 5 o'clock, their procession of 3 cars reached the cemetery. So that's all who's there. And they're heading out with the body to bury it. And then all of a sudden, there's a sound of another car, and a man with owl-eyed glasses, whom I had found marveling over Gatsby's books in the library 3 months ago, shows up to the funeral. So remember, this is owl eyes. And we talked about the fact that owl eyes was another sort of symbol for a witness, just like the billboard of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg with those big glasses. Owl eyes is that way too. And here he is at this funeral. So the other thing that that Nick remembers is that Daisy never sent a message or any flowers. And the only thing they hear at the funeral, besides the minister sort of giving a little prayer, is "Blessed are the dead that the rain falls on." And then the old owl-eyed man said, "Amen to that." And then they head back to the house, and all Owl Eyes says as they're leaving is, "That poor son of a bitch." We're going to stop here because I'd like to have a little bit more of a focus on the end of this chapter and the end of the book.